Hello everyone and welcome to a half pint session. Today's episode is a little special because it is going out as a half pint video session now, but later this season you'll hear the entire interview appear on our regular audio podcast. And the reason I'm doing that is I didn't want to have to wait until the end of the season for you to meet two of my favorite people who have launched my favorite new C.S. Lewis podcast, the host of the Lesser Known Lewis podcast, Sean and Jordan. The first co-host is Jordan. Jordan is a famously sought-after bachelor. He's an excellent youth worker and worship leader. He is the sort of scholar that spreads J.I. Packer on toast and the kind of science fiction fan who drinks a pint of Cylon's blood for breakfast. And the second co-host is Sean, who is president of Easton College, where he and Jordan became friends, and he is married to Melissa, and they have 3 young children together. He is the sort of avid hunter who has organ meat on toast, and the kind of spiritual leader who drinks a pint of Celtic monk's blood for breakfast. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It is great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
We should mention that Sean and I wrote each other's infos. I don't claim for myself to be a famously sought-after bachelor.
Oh, Jordan, don't lie. I know that you demanded that be in your intro for everybody to hear. Yeah, no, it's true. We did that little shout-out to our friends in Out of the Silent Planet.
Well, Matt has been single for the entirety of the time that we've done Pints with Jack, and I keep promising to find him a bride. So there's hope for you yet, Jordan.
Yeah, I thought maybe he needed some competition in the Lewis podcast dating world.
You two could go out clubbing together. I'm sure it'd be great. You need a wingman.
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, since we are recording on Ash Wednesday, today I am drinking a very penitential glass of water. It's tepid, it's not even cold. Although it is in a Pints for Jack glass, which makes it non-penitential because it improves the taste by about 20 to 30% for any liquid. Are you guys drinking anything?
I was going to follow Matt's lead because he's kind of given permission to drink scotch during Lent on former episodes, but I decided it would be best if I didn't. And so I did the next best thing. I got a Twinings tea, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Lapsang Souchong, I think. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty smoky tea. So it's kind of scotch-like.
It's the Lafroig of teas.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the scotch of the tea world.
How about you, Sean?
I'm drinking a Mexican hot chocolate. I don't know if they're called that everywhere, but it's just your regular kind of cocoa and whatnot with Mexican chili powder in it as well.
Nice.
And that felt like a good, Lent Ash Wednesday afternoon kind of drink.
Well, today's episode is going to be coming out on the YouTube channel a few days before we release episode 12 of our audio podcast, where we actually toast in Turkish. However, since Sean actually lived in Turkey, I would like him to lead the toast and teach us how to say cheers properly in Turkish.
No, that's right. It's nice and easy. It quite literally means to honor, but it is to say şerefe.
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 Penitential. So, gentlemen, what has been your experience of Lewis prior to starting this podcast? Let's just fill in a little bit of the background, and then we'll talk about your podcast proper.
Yeah, well, I think talking about Lewis is much like talking about my Christian testimony. It's kind of like I've been a Christian as long as I can remember. I don't remember a time when Lewis wasn't in my life, you know? I know I read Narnia as a child, but I don't remember when. I know I remember I had read Screwtape and Mere Christianity probably as a teenager, but I don't exactly remember those experiences. And I know I attempted reading Problem of Pain and Miracles as a young adult, probably in Bible school when I was at the Bible school that Sean now is the president of. But yeah, Lewis was just always there in my life, kind of in the background, very helpfully. But it wasn't really until 2 years ago when I was in seminary that a professor assigned 2 essays to us during an apologetics focused week. And my imagination really was rebaptized. And there was just something about Lewis that was reinvigorating among everything else I had been reading in seminary. And yeah, I'll pick it up there when we talk about why we started the podcast. But Sean?
Yeah, I'm more of a late bloomer than Jordan was in terms of the whole Lewis world. But like Jordan, and I'm sure most of the listeners, I started with Narnia, same thing. But I took a read through Mere Christianity, probably my first or second year of college as well. And to be honest, it left me a little bit disinterested in Lewis. It didn't connect with me at first. I wasn't a fan. But somewhat providentially, maybe a year later or so at Christmas time, I was given Screw Tape, and reading through that, it was just the right time. It was the right time to encounter that side of Lewis's imagination that just illuminates something that we're so familiar with already. But just give it so much more nuance and color and meaning. And so, we all know that Lewis just looms really large over kind of Protestant and evangelical thought in general. So he was always there. He was a part of the mosaic as I went through my education, theological education. But actually, I got to say, Pints with Jack was a big part of it for me. Yes. That's right. Win for you guys is that while I was living overseas, we had less access to theological libraries and things like that. So when I got a little hankering for some Jack, it was through podcasts. And so while I lived in Turkey, I got exposed to a little bit more of who he was, and then only a couple of years later moved into this podcast zone, which has drastically broadened my understanding of Lewis.
Well, let's talk about that, because Matt and I, we started Pints with Jack obviously for the fame, the fortune, and the babes.
Naturally.
But why did you guys start one? Was Pints with Jack not good enough for you? What was the deal?
We thought we got to fill all these holes that Pints with Jack is leaving. No, nothing of that nature.
Yeah, it's mostly a response podcast to Pints with Jack. We just we'll respond episode by episode. Here's what they got wrong. No, it was like I said, when I was in seminary, I was falling in love again with Lewis, and I had this goal to read everything that I hadn't yet read by Lewis. And I started with The Great Divorce and with a collection of his essays, which I just grabbed. This is what I got, and I started there. And when I started going through The Great Divorce, that's when I found Pints with Jack. And I loved it, and I thought, this is excellent. And I really wish that there was something like that for the essays. Mm-hmm. And I took a little look, and I couldn't find anything. And I since found out that I just didn't look hard enough. And there's things like William O'Flaherty's podcast. He does some essay chats. And we actually will be recording with William next week on our podcast. So I'm excited for that. But at the time I was thinking, I wish there was, people doing a deep dive on Lewis's essays to help walk through and kind of explore some more thoughts about what he's talking about. But I was in the middle of seminary at the time, and I didn't have time to do more than just think about it. And so I just kind of put the idea aside. But little did I know that my friend Sean, who we hadn't really been in touch too much at the time. Well, I think he was in Turkey while I was having this experience, but about a year later, maybe Sean, you could pick up the story.
Yeah. And I just happened to pick up when I moved back to Canada. I was fresh back in the country here, and I was reading a collection of Lewis's essays on literature and on reading. It was something that I came across there, and he recommended rereading. He says any great book is worth reading at least once every 10 years. And I was really challenged by that because I'm more of a volume than a depth reader. And so I went back, and Jordan is one of my friends whose opinions I trust. I said, hey, Jordan, what are, 5 nonfiction books that you would recommend that I read? And he responded with Lewis.
Yeah, I kind of joked. I said, like, just so you know, probably most of my, like, can my whole list be Lewis?
And so then, it caught my attention, simply because this is all came from Lewis. And right away he gets back to me. He's like, "Hey, can we talk about this idea that I have?" And that for me, it felt like it really scratched an itch, because, in my then fresh role here at Eston College, I could see, I'm relating to pastors and ministry leaders often, and biblical scholars and that kind of thing. And then of course students as well. And it felt like a wide swath of the body of Christ could really be served by some of the ideas that Lewis explores, even if you don't agree completely with all his conclusions or his methods or that kind of thing. He's just such a force to be reckoned with. So I thought, let's do this. This dovetails really well with where I'm at.
And I joked earlier about you guys finding gaps in Pints with Jack and it not being enough, but I was overjoyed when I found out what you guys were doing, because honestly, it kind of took the pressure off a little bit, because I have sketched out how long it's going to take me to get through all of his corpus on Pints with Jack. And I was kind of worried about the essays. Kind of worried about the letters. I have another plan for that, but I'll reveal that some other time. But when I knew that you guys were starting to tackle it, I was really happy, because the entire point of Pints with Jack is to provide people with an on-ramp, get them enthusiastic about Lewis, help them wrestle with some of the things that he's talking about, and just point them at resources so they can read him more deeply. And it's really great that people are out there looking at the lesser known parts of Lewis's corpus. And also, Lewis's essays is now probably the weakest part of my knowledge of him. It used to be poetry, but we had Poetry Month last season, so I inhaled vast amounts of that over a short period of time. And so it's a wonderful education for myself to listen to you guys and then go back and read and listen to the essays themselves, as well as see all of the connection points between Lewis's individual essays and his major works, which is something that we will do shortly, talking about religion and rocketry and the seeing eye.
Yeah, and there's so many connection points. And like you said, the essays are they're a little daunting and seem unappealing, because when there's so many good fiction and nonfiction works of Lewis's, and so many popular ones, and you just want to get into all of those, you get a cover like this, and it's just like essay collection. That just seems so unappealing. And I found when I was reading Horse and His Boy this year, there's this part where Aravis talks about the stories that people tell. And she says that people prefer to read stories, and she has never heard of anyone who wanted to read the essays. And I just thought, how true is that? Nobody wants to read the essays. Lewis himself is aware of it. But reading Lewis's essays, for me, I realized they are just as good, just as interesting. Really, all they are basically chapters of his nonfiction stuff that never got put together with other chapters to form a book. So they're one-off chapters, and most of them are 10 to 15 minute reads. I don't think we've covered anything yet that would take you more than half an hour to read in one sitting. So it's not like a big investment to read.
And sometimes it's entire books. When people struggle with the abolition of man, I send them to go in and read The Poison of Subjectivism.
Yeah.
Go read that. It is a much more accessible essay, but it's also way quicker to read, and you get the thrust of his point, that you can then come back to the abolition of man and see the other things that he's mixing into the cocktail, so to speak.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And many of them, have they're so punchy, and they are so brief, and you use the word, David, accessible. They're so accessible that I found that it fulfilled the need of some intellectual stimulation. But because Lewis is such a master of metaphor and such a master of simile and of kind of thought experiment, that kind of thing, that he drew me in to these really abstract ideas and almost tricked me because of how well crafted his prose is.
I'm actually starting a local C.S. Lewis reading group. Our first meeting is in a week and a half, and I've decided to start with one of his essays The Weight of Glory, because I don't know who can ever possibly read that and not get excited.
Yeah. That's right. Totally agree.
Well, let's talk about the podcast itself a little bit. Could you mind filling it in a little bit? How's it structured? How long do your episodes last? What kind of material have you covered so far? What are you thinking about doing in the future?
Yeah, well, our episodes are mainly Sean and I just having a conversation. They're pretty casual. We try to do two things. The first is that we just walk through the content, and hopefully you get a pretty good idea of what Lewis says in the essay, what his main point is, the main themes, and walk away with some of his best quotes. In that way you try, or hopefully you get to look at the essay, as it were. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of structure, we normally spend about an hour talking about each essay, or if they're very short essays and they cover the same theme, then we'll group them together. But then we break that into two conversations. So that'll be anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes per episode. We started doing that in season 2. Season 1, the episodes are a little bit longer, typically. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've been experimenting as we've been learning how to podcast and getting feedback from listeners and more experienced podcasters and trying to learn different things. But yeah, our first season was a little bit of a beta test just to see even if podcast was a worthwhile endeavor. And what we attempted in our first season was to look at essays that were timely for our world at this moment. And it just feels like what's going on in the world, there's a lot of crisis and turmoil. And what got us excited about Lewis's essays to begin with was that there was so much that felt timely for our world today. And so we looked particularly at those essays, and we started with 5 essays was our goal. We're like, these 5 are so timely. Let's just do a little short series on these 5 essays. And really quickly, those 5 essays turned into 13 essays. And so they were essays like, I won't list them all, but like on living in an atomic age, learning in wartime, the necessity of chivalry, equality, meditation on the third commandment. And so we touched on things like the war in Ukraine, a lot of politics stuff that came up, gender, social justice, a lot of COVID talk, COVID policies got in there. You didn't think that Lewis would be so prophetic in that way, but he really was. And it made me very uncomfortable at times just to speak publicly in this way. I'm not the sort of guy who likes to try and get his voice into these debates. But in a way, I was comforted just being able to say, I'm not saying it, Lewis is saying it.
Yeah.
And I think he's got a good point in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. And then season 2, we stray more into devotional topics. So we're talking about prayer and the Psalms and Advent, different things from the church calendar, Advent, Christmas, and now we're into Lent, of course, as well. And again, Lewis just has so much in that vein.
Mm. And what about in future seasons? Do you know what you're going to be doing? Do you have plans?
Yeah, we definitely do. We're going to try, we have some goals for all of our future seasons, which we'll speak to. And then maybe we'll tell you what our third season is, because we have plans at least as far as the third season coming up. But our goals for all of our seasons, now that we've kind of got our feet on the ground and have an idea of what we're doing as a podcast, we're going to take these first 2 seasons as goalposts, kind of, that we want to focus on keeping Lewis as timely for our world today. So whatever essay we're looking at, we're going to kind of be thinking, how is this timely for what's going on in our world today? As well as, how is Lewis acting as a guide for our spiritual life? So, how does this help us for our discipleship to Christ? So those kind of 2 things are going to be at the forefront of our minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that really evolved out of the fact that as we continue to read Lewis together as friends and discuss it, that this theme of discipleship and being formed into the image of Christ is really the most important part of what Lewis has to offer. He has so much to offer, and it's not only that, but it's really the tip of the spear. So we have 3 goals moving forward. One is that every essay and kind of episode that we release of the podcast is edifying, spiritually speaking, that it's really practical. It's something that one of our parents could listen to, or a freshman could listen to and get it and act on it. And of course that it's Christ-centered. This is about lesser known Lewis, but I mean, Lewis was also a master at pointing upward to Jesus. And so in terms of his faith, we want to honor that and point to Christ.
That's very similar to our own tagline when we talk about exploring Christianity, the truth and beauty through the lens of C.S. Lewis. He's the guy that we're looking through so we can see things a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I think that's our most important piece, is that we want to be Christ-centered. And like I was saying earlier, we try to do 2 things. The first is that we try to look at the essay, but we also try to look along the essay. So using that great picture from Lewis's essay, Meditation in a Tool Shed, which we will be covering later this fall with special guests from Pints with Jack on. So just a little teaser there. But the idea that we would look along Lewis, or maybe look along the essay, to see who Lewis is always pointing to, and he's always pointing to Christ. And so in that way, we kind of hope, and we didn't plan this with our name, but we kind of hope that by the end of our episode, Lewis becomes lesser known so that Christ would become more well known. That's really our whole heart with the whole podcast. Sean and I, we do love Lewis, but at the end of the day, we love other things and other people, and we have other interests. Ultimately, we love Jesus, and Lewis is a means to seeing Jesus better. So that's kind of our big goal with all of our seasons. But Sean, do you want to give a little sneak preview of our 3rd season coming up?
Yeah, we're diving into some meat. We're going to start it this summer and get into one of my favorite topics, which is myth and myth and truth and how that all works together. So we're going to look at things like On Myth and Metaphor, and Myth Became Fact, is theology, poetry, all those kinds of things too. And like we already teased, we're going to be collaborating with you, David.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Great, we are too.
And speaking of which, it's always fun hanging out with other people that podcast to sort of compare notes on experiences. So what would you say you've learned over the course of doing the show so far?
Well, I mean, each essay I walk away with personal learning in the form of like probably a personal repentance list of things I need to go pray about.
Do you mean things like saying or mouth sounds?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Saying
I'm still editing all of our episodes, and I can't stand myself anymore. I don't even want to talk at all. But there, I just did it again. Thinking more critically is something I'm learning from Lewis. Reading his writing, even in an essay like Why I'm Not a Pacifist, the first half of the essay, he starts with saying, here's how you think critically. It's not even about pacifism or anything. He just says, before I explain to you why I'm not a pacifist, let me tell you how to think critically. And then I will use that critical thinking to explain my argument. Things like that. But yeah, it's so helpful to read his writing because it helps you think and see more clearly.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Sean?
Yeah, a lot. I've learned a lot. And of course, part of it is just the craft, but then a lot of it is that Lewis is not as bound, I think by virtue of his study of literature and history, he is not as bound by maybe the zeitgeist of his own personal age as other writers, maybe, or other thinkers, and just the populace in general. And so when I particularly remember reading Living in an Atomic Age, and other things like it, he breaks us out of the idea that our circumstances and maybe this generation is just so historically unique. So we need to panic because we have no example to follow or pattern to live by or anything like that. And I feel like reading Lewis more, especially these timely essays that we're talking about, has made me a calmer, more peaceful person, and given me a lot more perspective on, both the beauty that we live through, in and around, and also the reality that if it feels like there's a sword of Damocles dangling above our heads, there is, but that's okay, because every human who's ever lived has lived that way. And I feel like, that's really kind of grown my peace in the midst of social media and news cycle driven world.
Yeah. Well, what's been the hardest thing about doing the podcast?
Brevity. Lewis is so good, and I feel like even some of his throwaway lines we could do an entire podcast on. And so, and I mean, just doing it with a friend, as again, David, as you know, having a conversation with friends over a couple of pints, which is the way you've structured your show here, is something that can just go on and on and on, and it's great that way. But we try and be as brief as possible, if I'm honest, because we could have a lesser known Lewis podcast that was just about any one of his essays. I guess I could say any one of his essays. We could go on and on. How about Jordan? I don't know how you'd answer that.
For me, the hardest part is the feeling of imposter syndrome. Just feeling like, why are Sean and I the guys doing this podcast? It felt okay when it was just Sean and I, and then we put it out, and then we were just getting like our friends and family to listen. But then as soon as we started getting some people listening who we didn't know, all of a sudden I felt like, I don't know if we should be doing this, because who are we? Like, and it's one thing if, say we were trying to cover Narnia and we're just guys who like reading children's books, and anyone can have an opinion on a children's book. But when you start digging into like Lewis's essays, it feels like maybe you should know a thing or two about a thing or two. And I feel like, I don't know if that's us, but I guess, it was comforting, David. We, early on, I reached out to you, and you were gracious enough to FaceTime with me. And you said, you reminded us that we're amateurs, and because we love Lewis, that's our qualification. That's what we're doing. And we are bringing other lovers of Lewis along with us. So I mean, that's what we're doing. But every time Sean and I sit down, I'm like, I don't know if we know enough to say anything about this. But yeah, I
think you have to really lean into that amateur status. Mm-hmm. I actually want to incorporate that into the intro next season, particularly if we're doing a heavy book that I definitely feel out of my depth with. Mm-hmm. But Lewis himself says, I want to say it is in one of his essays, that very often the beginner can be a better teacher because the expert has forgotten what was even difficult in the first place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the very fact that you guys have struggled in some episodes over some of the content of the essays, I've actually really appreciated that because it's reminded me that actually not everything is super straightforward either in how he communicates it, although he's obviously generally very good, but also a lot of the topics that he tackles are not simple topics. Mm-hmm. You keep on wanting to bring other objections and try and synthesize the whole. But for me, that's kind of the entire point of recording a podcast and listening to a podcast, is to begin that struggle, begin that conversation, and hear some ideas from people that aren't me, because I already know what I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Sean and Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show. As I hear the landlord ring the bell for final drinks, can you tell people more about where they can find out about your podcast and listen to it?
It's been an honor and a delight, David. Thank you so much for having us. If someone wants more, they can search Lesser Known Lewis on all major podcast apps. You can listen to us there, or on Facebook and Instagram, Lesser Known Lewis. And you can also follow little updates and extra Lewis-related content on either of those social media platforms as well.
And if you just want more info on us or want to find our episodes organized a little more nicely than the podcast apps tend to have us, we have a webpage, which is kindly hosted at pintswithjack.com/LKL, or lesser-known-Lewis is another way to do it.
That's a great website.
Yeah, it is a great website. Go check out that whole Pints with Jack deal. But new as of last week, patreon.com/lesser-known-Lewis. If you would like to support us there. I know I'm really the weak partner in this partnership. Jordan's the one who does a lot of the work, and so if you want to help Jordan out financially, especially, you can go to patreon.com/lesser-known-Lewis.
In virtually every single podcast that I've known where there's a pairing of people, there's always a Matt and there's always a David. It's just the way of things.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Although I'm a pretty big Taylor Swift fan.
Ooh.
So I don't know.
I think that only makes you half now.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this half pint session. Please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.